From Moment to Movement with Tamara Banks has been made possible through the generous support of the Anchor Point Foundation, helping nonprofit organizations and leaders creatively solve problems in their communities around the world.
Racism is steeped into the very core of this country, and now, in 2020, Black voices are tired of being ignored, muffled, and killed. Millions of Americans are demonstrating, protesting, to make their voices heard, especially Black Americans. A movement has to arise from the ashes of the moment. From Moment to Movement is a series of one-on-one truth-telling conversations with the Black community, aimed at working towards addressing police brutality and changing systemic racism.
Hi everyone, I'm Tamara Banks, your host for From Moment to Movement, a platform for Black voices to be heard, unfiltered and uncensored. We're experiencing an important moment. African Americans need this moment. This year, we're seeing an unprecedented number of demonstrations all across the country. From Moment to Movement aims to provide a platform for Black voices. And while it's not the Black community's responsibility to educate white people, From Moment to Movement will provide information on resources for white folks who want to learn how to engage in thoughtful, respectful conversations with African Americans. Get educated about things like Jim Crow and understand how systemic racism actually works. We'll talk about racial battle fatigue and white fragility. What you're about to hear are passionate, heartfelt thoughts and reflections and real-life stories. Our first guest is Jason St. Julien, a prosecutor with the Department of Justice. Jason, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here.
Good morning, Tamara. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, we should say from the onset that we're not talking about cases, ongoing cases with the Department of Justice or anything you're currently working on. Just to be fair to our viewers, because they're going to want to know why am I not asking certain questions. But we, as a journalist, I know we can't ask you those specific questions. But what we do want to hear from you is sort of your background and your experience, essentially as being a Black man in America. So let me start with the first question to you, Jason, is that often we see African Americans, men and women, going into law practice as defense attorneys. You went a different path. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to be a prosecutor.
Sure. So the first part of that question, the answer to that question is that when I looked at what do I really want to do, criminal law to me is just more interesting than civil law. So I chose criminal law based on that. And second, I had the privilege of working and clerking for 2 federal district court judges and being in court almost every single day for 3 years. And based on that, based on my experiences in the courtroom, I chose to be a prosecutor because that's what interested me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I understand that. So as we kind of take a look at some of the incidences that are occurring across the country, which has really never stopped since Black Africans were brought to this country as products and animals. When you see these videos that are making the headlines and still making the headlines a month or more later, with George Floyd in particular, and then we hear the stories of Breonna Taylor, and then Ahmaud Arbery going for a jog in Brunswick, Georgia, and being literally run down, and with 2 white men with a shotgun. What goes through your mind?
So, Tamara, the best way I can explain this, well, first of all, I haven't watched all these videos in their entirety because that is entirely too close to home for me. As a Black man, I live that every day. And those videos, it's too tough to watch. So number one, I haven't watched all the videos in their entirety because that's a very difficult thing to see someone who looks like me being hunted down and killed. Now, the best way I can explain, the spaces that I go through when I see these things are that It's like a rubber band. I expand and I contract. And I have these amazing moments where I'm expanding and I'm empowered because I'm making a difference when we're talking about the conversation about race. And I'm sharing of myself and I'm having a conversation, getting in someone else's world and making a difference. And then I also have moments where, you know, I'm contracting when I don't want to get present to the fact that this is still happening. I don't want to get present to the fact that I'm hearing news reports of young Black men being found hanging in trees. Like I don't want to see that. And I don't want to realize that that's reality. And so day in, day out, I have these moments of expanding, contracting, hundreds and hundreds times every day. And, you know, the most important part of that, Tamara, is that, you know, I've given myself permission to feel whatever there is to feel and not make it wrong that I'm contracting and not make it wrong that I may be angry or frustrated. And in the midst of that, that gives me power to then expand again and actually be the difference in this conversation about race.
Well, you raise a very important point that people will say, but it didn't happen to you, or I didn't own slaves, or I wasn't the cop who did this. But what I think I hear you saying is that the emotional trauma is a domino effect, not just through the community and nation at large, but really within the Black community. So the first thing you think of when you see a police officer coming at you, I'm going to run, you know, and so people will say, well, you shouldn't run because now you're look suspicious. Well, the trauma of being 3 or 4 centuries now of what has happened to Africans and African Americans is now sort of steeped into our DNA. Is that what I hear you saying?
It is. And, you know, to comment on a point you made, like, look, this has happened to me. You know, look, Tamara, I come from a place where there was a KKK meeting and or program televised every other week or every week. You know, I come from a place where people sent my dad hate mail saying that he was the token N-word. I come from a place where people have spat on me, thrown food at me. You know, I come from a place where in high school, someone killed Black cats, gutted them, and left them in our yard to send a message. Like, that's the place where I come from. So look, this is real. You know, this is absolutely real. It's happening. And Tamara, this is not just something, you know, that happened, you know, 100 years ago. You know, when I got food thrown on me, you know, this was in law school. You know, so we're not talking about maybe 8, 9 years ago. You know, in my lifetime, these are things that I experienced. And while Black and brown people are not monolithic, we do have a shared experience. And my own unique experiences are just an individuation of the larger shared experience. So I say what I've experienced isn't necessarily just unique to me.
So let me just ask you real quick. You don't have to say specifically which school you went to, although we could Google it, or where you grew up. Just curious, were you born and raised in the South with these experiences?
Yes.
Okay. And the reason I ask is because I'm currently living in Atlanta, so it's nothing unusual for me to, not so much in Atlanta, but just outside Atlanta in various parts of Georgia, to see Confederate flags, and even in Atlanta, Confederate soldier monuments. But what I want people to understand is that these sorts of things don't just happen in the South. They happen in Denver. They happen in Los Angeles. They happen in Minneapolis. So, so back to your experience. You know, it just I hear a lot of people, often younger folks in their 20s, but sometimes people in other age groups too, saying, "Wow, you know, racism has just really picked up recently." But what you're sharing with me, that is this is not something new that just happened, something that just got in the headlines because 2020 has just been a crazy year. How do we reach then forward and pull up our young people that are coming up behind us, whether they're in law, journalism, education, and what have you, to sort of synthesize, take in what's coming in, be informed, but not be, for lack of a better term, overwhelmed and paralyzed and unable to just live and sort of want to shut down and lock themselves away from reality?
Sure. So my first response to that is that we have to model that it is okay to feel whatever we're feeling. That, Tamara, we can't make it wrong that, I'll use the pronoun I can't make it wrong that I'm feeling frustrated or sad or angry or bitter. Now, that's not a place to just stay in that place, because there's no, whatever action I take out of that place isn't going to be empowering. But the first part is like, look, however you're feeling, that's okay. Like, don't run away from it. Like, just be with it. Okay. Now that I'm with my anger, frustration, bitterness, okay, what is there to do? Because look, myself, we are modeling to those coming behind us what it is like to be a part of this movement. They are watching us and they are listening to us. And what there is to do is take action. Look, we can hope all we want. We can think all we want. Where we impact the world is action. Werner Erhard made an amazing quote when he said that it's important that you get clear for yourself that your only access to impacting life is action, because the world doesn't care what you think, what you want, how you feel. Take a look at life as it is lived and see for yourself that the world only moves for you when you act. So to answer your question, it's okay to be whatever way you are. Be with that. And then now, okay, what action can we take? What action can we take right now to move the ball?
And what action can people take? Young, old, black, white? What are some constructive things to do, you think?
Sure. This all starts with a conversation, because, Tamara, look, the idea of race, all that is a conversation. And that conversation started hundreds of years ago. And it's a conversation. And we can transform that conversation if we are willing to have conversations with other people about it. And notice that the word I'm using, conversation, not an argument. In an argument, no one's going to move the ball. And in that conversation, look, we have to tell the truth. We have to say what is real, because until we master the truth, there's no way that we can master the conversation. So to answer your question, what action you can take, look, that everybody today will have an opportunity in some type of conversation. They may hear something or see something, and they can make the stand and say, look, I just heard this or saw this. And what you did or what you said, the purpose of that was to subjugate Black and brown people. And I don't tolerate that. And if that's who you choose to be, then I'm not tolerating that. Like, that is a simple step that we can take. And people would be amazed that, look, when we tolerate nothing and we acquiesce to nothing, like, people tend to start straightening out.
That's right. Right. Jason, if there's part of the reason for this show, or the main reason for this show, is that, like I say in the open, people are, Black folks are tired of being muffled, or their voices ignored, or completely stifled and killed. We want to use this program as a way to elevate and amplify Black voices. And I think now is a time where people, the mainstream white community, is ready to at least listen. What is it that you want to say if you had the ear of your white colleagues, your white neighbors, the white folks at the grocery store, the white folks across town in Denver, and across the country in Atlanta? What would you like to say?
Two things. So I'd say this to the world, including my white colleagues and friends, that one, this is real. This is happening. Racism and discrimination is real. So let's just be straight on that. Now, the second point is that, look, I declare that we are at the tipping point, that we have reached it, Tamara. It's not as though the tipping point is somewhere off in the near future and we may get there. We have reached the tipping point. We now have a critical mass of human beings, Black, brown, white, across the world, that are no longer willing to accept status quo as it relates to race relations. Like, we are there. And now the question is, what action are we going to take? Because Tamara, if we wait for someone else to come do something, that's not going to happen. You know, there's not going to be some opportune moment to take action. The moment is opportune when you say it's opportune. And I declare we're at the tipping point, and we have a critical mass of human beings ready and willing to transform this conversation about race.
Great. Jason St. Julien, that's a perfect place to end our conversation, although I know we could talk for many more hours, but hopefully this is just the beginning of the conversations. And as you said, that's the place to start. I so appreciate your time. You stay safe and healthy out there.
I will. And thank you, Tamara, for all that you are doing now, all that you've done in the past, and all that you will do to make a difference for the world and everyone that you interact with. Thank you for what you do, and please keep doing it.
Jason, thank you for encouraging people, especially the white community, to stand up and say something when they see Black people being subjugated. Our next guest is a woman who empowers young people who want to change the world and make it a better place for everyone. Janiece, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, talk a little bit more about YASPA, what it stands for, and what your mission is.
Yeah, thank you so much. So YASPA is Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, or YASPA for short. This is our 10-year anniversary this year. Super excited about that. It was founded in 2010 by myself and my husband. And the purpose is to cultivate Black and Brown and Indigenous students to be civically engaged in community and career, middle school through college. And the ways in which we do that is by focusing on academic and career efficacy, civic literacy, civic engagement, and racial identity development. We offer youth council spaces where students are able to navigate youth participatory action research on issues that they care about, to bring that into the policy space. We also offer courses for the middle school and high school level, which is civic engagement in community and career, to expose students to the myriad of ways in which they can navigate or pursue a degree that is oriented with a social justice lens. We also have a summer program, which is a hybrid right now because of COVID, but it's our Social Sciences and Policy Institute, which is almost kind of like a playground to expose students to, again, the myriad of ways in which they can be civically engaged, but also with this focus on centering wellness as well, because we know that in pursuing social justice, that it can be taxing. And so that's something that we also make sure is sort of baked into that experience as well. We also really try and push against unpaid labor, including youth. So we offer paid internships for students at the high school and the college level as well.
What I think about is the notion that I'm not even sure I had heard the term social justice until I was an adult, maybe several years ago, maybe 10 years ago from now. That's really terrific that you're kind of guiding young people into this space that they can kind of grow up and be groomed and mentored, for lack of a better term, to step into it. Because I think a lot of people have had to sort of feel their way around and what does social justice mean and what's a social justice warrior. And you said you're celebrating your 10-year anniversary.
Yes. 10 years. It's a wild year to be celebrating our 10-year anniversary, but we've had a lot of support from community this year, which has really been a blessing.
So on that note, the timing of the 10-year anniversary and what's happening now, a lot of people tell me, particularly young folks, but not always millennials, but a wide range of people will often say, wow,
police brutality and racism is really picking up. I say picking up, I'm sorry. When was that time where it wasn't happening, when racism was eradicated from the U.S. and police brutality across the nation was not happening at all? So as you start to have conversations and educate our young people, where do you start? Where do you start sort of your curriculum so they can understand how they need to move the needle forward?
That's a great question. So usually we really start with things that they're locked into a lot of times, which is even social media, right? So it could be TikTok, it could be clips from Facebook, YouTube videos that they may be into, and just asking them to really look at and deconstruct the ways in which race is happening within whatever it is that they're watching, like just picking up on that, noticing, right? And then from there, going into, well, why do you think you noticed that? Or why do you think you didn't notice that, right? And helping them to understand the ways in which we're socialized to understand race at a meta level, whether it's through our school systems, through media writ large, right? So that's typically where we start, so that then we can begin to get closer and closer to the soul, right? And doing that soul work.
So I have two questions. One, probably easier to answer, is what age is a good age to start this conversation?
Oh, I love that question too, especially as a mama. So I started it when they were in the womb. Meaning like these conversations have to happen right before babies are even brought into the world, but definitely even before they enter school, right? Because we know based upon lived experience and even research, if people want to go there, that race again is always happening. And it's a matter of equipping our young people to understand the ways in which it's happening so that they don't internalize it in a way that brings harm to themselves, whether mentally, physically, or emotionally.
And then sort of a second half of that question is, how do we teach young people, or any person of color specifically in this case, about racism, systemic racism, social injustice, and so forth, without instilling a sense of victimization?
Yeah, I really, really love that because I think it's an extremely important component. So I'm really obsessed with Dr. Cross's work on negrescence, or the psychology of becoming Black. His work has been used as a model for a myriad of racial identity development theories of folks of color in particular. And so really looking at those different cycles and shifts and stages of becoming Black in predominantly white spaces and even within Black spaces, right? And what does that look like for yourself? That is a lot of the work that I know I've done with my own children, as well as with our students in YASPA as well, making sure that they understand that while they're having these racialized experiences, they're having them again because of the compounding systems, right? And the ways in which our country was built. And that contributes to the ways in which they experience race at a meta level, right? Which informs what they are experiencing personally, so that then they don't have to accept certain baggage, right? So we're telling our young people all the time, we didn't create white supremacy, right? So you don't need to die over this. You don't need to sacrifice your wellness over this because we did not create this. So it's really important that they know that race and racism is simply not about Black and brown folks. It's about white supremacy. And it's also about the work that white folks need to be doing in their villages as well.
Remind me again what age groups you work with?
Middle school through college.
So with that said, particularly the middle school, was that like 12-ish years old?
Yep.
Okay. When they look at the video of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery being chased down, or hearing the news about Breonna Taylor with several gunshots in her body as she tried to defend herself in her bedroom, how do you articulate that to a 12-year-old, and what kind of advice or information can you share with folks to
help them understand how, whether you're a parent or you have children in your life, to be able to have this conversation in a safe space without scaring them?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, especially as a mom as well, because for me, that conversation had to happen very early. It was particularly Trayvon Martin for our household when we had to have that conversation. And my youngest was only 2 years old when she saw what was happening on the screen, and trying to explain that, right, to a baby essentially was very difficult. What I will say is that first, simply having the conversation, right? So the worst thing that we can do is not have the conversation. No one's perfect. It's going to be a conversation where you may stumble through it. So rather than obsessing over the quote unquote correct way, if you will, to have the conversation first and foremost. Second, I would say, really think about the narratives that you are authoring and co-signing with your children, right? Lean into their curiosities as well. So allow them to do a lot of the asking of questions, but also ask them questions as well, just to see where their headspace is at, so that you can know how to tap in to that headspace and what to offer them in that headspace, so that you're not completely overwhelming them or scaring them. But again, what I will say is that it is scary. We have to just acknowledge that, right? That there's unfortunately nothing we can do necessarily to dismiss the fact that it is scary for young people and grown Black adults as well to see that repetitively, and it leads to racial battle fatigue. So it's better to have those conversations, as difficult as they may be, rather than to be dismissive of those conversations, because then, for instance, they end up in maybe my college classroom, right? And they're like, I don't know what to do about this, because this is the first time, quote unquote, I'm having this conversation. And so I know for my children, even though it was Trayvon Martin, having those conversations very early on has really helped them to get through this time and be able to protect their emotional wellness in this time as well.
Do in your classes or practices, do you also have white children, white young people engaged in the dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly with the class model, we don't necessarily choose the students, right? So it's definitely a multiracial space for sure as well. And so that's where, again, we start with what they're exposed to, but then we get at the soul work. So we talk a lot about, who you are as an individual. And we don't use the word positionality with the kids, right? But helping them to understand how their identities shape their experiences, and how those experiences sometimes are similar or different, and why that is. And particularly in our classes, we center race as the crux that informs a multitude of identities, right? So race informs gender experiences. Race informs experiences of sexual orientation as well, right? Race informs class experiences as well. And so having that anchor really helps students to understand, even in a multiracial setting, that, oh, well, this is why my experience is different than the student that's sitting right next to me. This is what this means for me and my family. And that's really where the richness comes in, and also where solidarity can be forged as well.
It's almost like taking us back to when we were babies, little young children, where we didn't know that there were differences between us, that, the racism and prejudice is something that's taught. It's not something that we're born with. So it's almost like going back to the way God intended us to be, I think it sounds like.
Amen to that.
So 10-year anniversary. I'm wondering if you have any success stories you'd like to share. A student that you had 10 years ago, say they were 12, 11, 12, 13, and now they're 22, 23, or what have you, and they're doing something in the social justice space.
Oh, where do I start? Oh, goodness. So first I'll start with Keely. So Keely is our CCA, which is the Community College of Aurora Gibbs Foundation Scholar. And what that means is that she received our 2-year scholarship for pursuing a social science degree. When we first met Keely, who's an alum of Aurora Central High School, Keely thought that she was going to be going into the STEM field, into medicine. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But as she participated in a myriad of campaigns with us, from transit equity to student voice, student vote, and trying to lower the voting age, to concurrent enrollment work as well, also leading student-led candidate workshops, she was like, actually, I want to do this. Whatever this is that YASPA's up to, I want to be a part of that. And so she decided to pursue political science actually as her degree, and just completed her first year of college. So we're super excited about that. Another student that comes to mind, well, no longer a student, is Tashawn Montgomery. So Tashawn Montgomery was a graduate from George Washington High School, participated in YASPA in the very kind of early formative years where I was really just trying to figure out a model, right? And we were more in the after school space. And Tashawn went on to University of Denver and is now an instructor with YASPA. So we also hire our alumni as well. So that's another story that just really brings my heart a lot of joy. Tiana Holmes now, she recently got married a couple years ago, is also in the criminal justice field. And so we're super, super proud of her and her raising her young family and continuing to pursue social justice at the crux of her career as well. Gosh, there's just so many stories.
Let me ask you one last question, Janiece, as we start to wrap up here. I'm asking people about how they're feeling right now. I mean, we're dealing with, like I said earlier, this isn't anything new. Evidence of police brutality caught on tape, even to the point where folks who just even a couple of years ago were like, well, you know, maybe it wasn't that bad, or, you know, cops can be jerks to white people too. It's a whole different mindset where we are right now. How are you feeling with everything? And what do you tell your young children about where we are today?
That's a beautiful question. I'll say first, I'll just start with the body, right? I will say that I feel a sense of calm, honestly, and anger, and frustration and sadness, depending on the day, depending on the moment. So first, I just want to acknowledge that my body feels all the things, depending on the day and the moment and conversation that I'm having with my kids or my team at YASPA and youth. So I first just want to acknowledge that it's not necessarily a constant across time. But what I will say, the reason why I started with I feel a sense of calm, though, is because I really, really try and orient myself as well as our work with this notion of education for liberation. And that's something that no one can take from you, right? So really being equipped with the mental and emotional fortitude allows us to, at times, cocoon ourselves when we need to in order to protect our emotional wellness. I've been telling folks recently that our work is a direct clapback to white supremacy, right? So we don't have to necessarily be performing civics, right, in order to be civically engaged. We have a right to protect our wellness, and that is also being civically engaged. So really getting away from this notion of performative civics is what I call it, and really thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be civically engaged for myself? Because when I do that and I center myself and my healing, that actually helps the entire ecosystem, particularly as young Black folks and even Black adults as well, because I want to be able to live to see my grandchildren and great grandchildren, right? And that's critical to this work as well. We need folks at all different angles and vantage points doing this work. We're not a monolith, and so we don't need to perform in certain ways in order to be civically engaged.
Right. That's great. That is so great. Janiece Mackey, thank you so much for joining us, Director of YASPA, Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism. What a great organization. I appreciate your time. You stay safe and healthy out there.
Thank you so much for having me.
We love the work you're doing, Janiece. And as you said, it's a direct clapback to white supremacy. Next, we hear from a Black police chief who gives us his unique perspective on police brutality and what he believes is needed for real police reform. Our guest today is Roy Minter, Chief of Police of Savannah, Georgia Police Department. Chief, welcome. So great to see you again.
Well, great to see you again, and thanks for this opportunity to join you.
Absolutely. Just to give folks a little bit of a background, in the interest of full disclosure, you before you moved to beautiful Savannah, you were chief of police in Peoria, Arizona, and before that, chief of police in Denton, Texas, and then before that, in Aurora, where you and I had a chance to do several stories together. So again, I appreciate your time. I know you're super busy, especially as a chief and a manager and supervisor of law enforcement out on the streets of Savannah. Appreciate that. My first question to you, Chief, is I'm curious, particularly about this question right now, is why did you want to become a police officer?
Well, that's a question I get a lot. And, I really enjoy answering that question, especially when I'm talking to youth and community. I never imagined myself getting into law enforcement. I was born and raised in the inner city in Detroit, Michigan. And if you'd asked me when I was in high school what I wanted to be when I grew up, police officer was nowhere on that list. I was the kid that grew up in a neighborhood where we didn't have officer friendly in our neighborhood. Usually the only time we saw the police in my neighborhood was when they were either writing somebody a ticket or taking somebody to jail. So I really didn't have a lot of respect for police when I grew up. And I always tease and tell people that I was the kid who hid in the bushes and threw rocks at the Detroit police cars when they drove down the street. And when I was in high school, my junior year of high school, I went to register for my classes. And I realized when I went back to see my guidance counselor, he said, "Hey, you're one class short of what you need for this semester." Well, when I finally got back to the room to register, there were only two classes that were left. It was a biology class and a criminal justice class. Well, mama didn't raise no fool. So I decided, maybe this criminal justice class will be an easy A for me. I didn't really look at the curriculum. And when I got to the class on the first day and the teacher started passing around a sign-up list, and I said, "What's the sign-up list for?" And he says, "Well, you have to sign up to work a minimum of 10 hours a week at one of the local police stations." And I said, "Well, I don't want to work at a police station. I don't even like cops." And he said, "Well, it's a requirement of the class. If you don't complete the co-op part of the class, you can't complete the class." So I signed up to work at one of the local, what they call mini stations in the neighborhood, 2 hours a day, Monday through Friday. And I got to know the police officers and see them in a different light and really earned a greater level of respect for what they do on a daily basis. So my senior year of high school, I voluntarily took the second half of the class. And then when I graduated from high school, guess what I wanted to be?
A police officer.
Absolutely.
So sort of fast forwarding to where we are today. Now I know you, I know your character, I know your integrity, and I know the type of individual you are and type of police officer you are. But a lot of people haven't experienced that, not just recently, but throughout time as we talk about policing in America. And we've discussed on this show before how police systems were sort of an outbreak of slave patrols, especially in the South. And so how are police departments, in your mind, sort of developed in the infrastructure to deal with the issues of the day, specifically racism?
Well, I guess the best answer I can give you, Tamara, if you as a law enforcement profession or a law enforcement agency have waited to this minute or this moment to really start addressing significant issues between law enforcement and the community, I can say you're way behind in the ball game. These are things that should have and could have been ongoing conversations for quite some time. We've been talking for quite some time about community policing and what that looks like. And, sometimes it's different in different areas. We've kind of moved beyond community policing. What we call our program here in Savannah is relationship-based policing, because we believe that, it's beyond having a partnership. We want to have a relationship with members of our community. And the difference we say is, when you have a relationship with someone, the two parties should be committed to each other. And we're committed to having that strong relationship with members of our community. And we hope members of our community are committed to having a strong relationship with us. We realize that this is both a tough and very interesting time for us here in law enforcement. We realize that there are different incidents that have occurred around the country that have really put the spotlight on us and how we do things and how we're viewed in the community. And it's really a great time for us as law enforcement professionals and the law enforcement profession as a whole to step up and either build on that great relationship, partnership that we have with members of our community, or really establish that strong relationship and partnership with members of our community.
Let me take a step back a little bit here and ask you about, so obviously you can't take off the color of your skin, but you can take off your uniform. Have you ever experienced negative reactions? Or maybe I'll ask you, what has been your experiences sometimes when you are driving through neighborhoods that typically are not populated with African Americans, or you go to a high-end store and you don't have your uniform on, it's just you, and people, do they follow you around? In other words, I guess I'm asking is, what is it like in your perspective to be a Black man in America, sans the uniform?
Well, you know, one of the things that I constantly remind people of is, I wear this uniform to work, but I wear this every day, and I live every day as an African-American male in our society, and I never forget that. And, you know, of course, I realize that there are times where people may see me in different areas and doing different things where I don't have this uniform on, or I'm not recognizable at that particular point in time as somebody who's a law enforcement officer in the community. And I've been in those situations where I've gone in stores and I've kind of gotten a look, and I've had people follow me around in stores. I also, since I've been a police chief, but when I was a police officer years ago, I was stopped in a neighborhood strictly because I believe that the sheriff deputy felt like I didn't belong in that neighborhood at that particular time of night. And the reason why I knew that that was probably the case was the minute I identified myself as a police officer, he immediately relaxed and then told me, hey, don't worry about it, just go ahead, you can leave. And my question was, why'd you pull me over in the first place? And he really struggled with trying to explain to me why he even made that initial traffic stop. But it was like, once he found out I was a police officer, he was like, well, you know, no big deal, you can just go ahead and go. And those are the types of situations where, you know, first and foremost, it brings your awareness back to, you know, realizing that, you know, sometimes things are different, and it's different in the way you're treated. Especially when you still live your life as an African-American male. But you also have to realize that there are still issues and concerns that are going on in our profession that need to be addressed.
So when you look at video of, for example, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, Elijah McClain in Denver, Colorado, do you view that as a police officer? Are you watching with a police officer lens and sort of thinking, well, what must they be thinking? Or are you viewing it as a Black man and possibly being in that victim's position?
Well, you know, Tamara, I think sometimes it's hard to separate the two because, like I said, I wear the uniform to work, but I live as an African-American male every day. And when you look at those types of situations, you have to understand and come to the realization of why those types of situations upset people and upset members of our community, because these are things that, you know, you continue to see over and over and over again that really pull at the heartstrings of people, rightfully so. You know, I've been a police officer for quite some time. I've been a police officer for over 30 years. I was a police officer when the Rodney King incident occurred. And I remember from a law enforcement perspective, you know, we took a step back and said, you know, we've got to do a better job of addressing arrest control and taking people into custody. When we had Ferguson with Michael Brown, and we had Baltimore with Freddie Gray, and we had New York with Eric Gardner, you know, we stepped back and looked at two really important things. We looked at tactics and techniques, but we also looked at transparency and things such as body-worn cameras. But when you look at a situation like what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and you look at someone who literally was begging a police officer for his life, and in his last breath called out to his deceased mother, and there was no sense of empathy or humanity on the part of that police officer, you can't help but get upset. And, you know, this is one of the few times that I've really seen where, you know, even really staunch supporters of law enforcement, whether that be community members or labor organizations, have all come out and said what we saw in that video was absolutely wrong. especially hearing that from labor groups. Because a lot of times with the labor groups, you usually hear one of three things. You usually hear, hey, don't rush to judgment. Or you usually hear, wait, you usually hear them defending the officer. Or you usually hear nothing, and they make no comments. And for an organization like the Fraternal Order of Police to come out and make a strong statement condemning the action of the officers really says a lot about those types of situations. So, I tell people, I get it. I completely understand. I hear them, and I acknowledge that what happened and what continues to happen needs to be addressed. And it's something that has to be on the forefront of what policing looks like now and what we anticipate it to look like in the future.
So certainly being able to see video has sort of shifted people's mindset in the mainstream white community. But we also had Trayvon Martin. Gosh, we can go as far back as Emmett Till. Is there something more going on in this moment that is shifting people into action? And it's not just Black and brown folks out there on the front lines protesting and demonstrating and rallying and prayer vigils and so on and so forth. It's white folks too. Was there something different about this moment, you think?
I think the big one was, when we saw the Rodney King video, I mean, people were upset about somebody who appeared to be struggling just to get off the ground, who was repeatedly being struck by police officers using a baton. When you look at the Breonna Taylor situation in Louisville, Kentucky, we've seen other situations where there have been narcotics or tactical type raids that have gone, turned into a really deadly force situation and turned deadly for someone. But I think this is one where people saw the video, whether you're Black, white, brown, Asian, young, old, seeing somebody who was literally begging for their life, and the person at the same point in time, was calling out for their mother to help them. And there was absolutely no empathy, no humanity, no feeling whatsoever from the part of the police officer. And I think this one really touched people's heartstrings, because everybody I talked to said, I've never literally seen somebody killed or dying in a video at the hands of a police officer.
Yeah, it was pretty breathtaking, to say the least. Let me just ask you one last question, Chief, to wrap it up and take you back to the beginning when you said that if right now in 2020 is the time that police departments are just now beginning to think about policies being implemented and training about racial differences, if they're just now starting to think about it, and I'm paraphrasing your words, they're in a lot of trouble. What can police departments do to bring themselves up to speed to where we need to be, to where they are judging people, a potential suspect, an individual walking down the street or driving their car, not based on the color of the skin, but really based on real legal issues that might be in play?
Well, there are a couple of things. First and foremost, I call it the ACP program. The first thing we have to do is we have to step up and acknowledge that there's an issue going on in this country with police-community relations. We can't bury our heads in sand anymore. We have to acknowledge that there's an issue. The second thing we have to do is we have to make a strong commitment to address those issues and not just continue to talk about it. And the third thing is we have to make it a priority. Now, in doing that, we always talk about training. But the big thing that we have to do, in addition to training, in addition to having strong policies and procedures in place, is there has to be strong accountability measures on the part of members of the department. You can train them, you can put policies in place, but if you're not holding people accountable on a daily basis, if you don't have good supervisors out there, and you're not making sure supervisors are holding people accountable, they're out there monitoring what people are doing, and if you don't have really good trust and confidence from the level of your community members that they feel that their law enforcement agency is out there treating people fairly and what they're doing is equitable for all people involved, then you're going to continue to have issues in your department. We're very fortunate here in Savannah that we have and continue to have a really good relationship with members of our community. And I think that showed very well in the fact that we've had very few protests. We've had no rioting, no looting, no property damage. And I think that's really a testament to the relationship that we have with members of our community and the great, strong community that we have here in Savannah.
As Chief Mentor said, it's important for police departments to have strong community relationships. That's the first step in police reform and stopping the killing of unarmed black people in America. The divisive national debate on race and policing is at a boiling point, but it's been smoldering all across the country for centuries. It's time we uproot it and deal with it. Thanks for joining us. I hope you heard something that inspired you and moved you into action. Keep the conversation going with us online at From Moment to Movement on pbs12.org, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on my website, TamaraMBanks.com. We'll see you next time.
From Moment to Movement with Tamara Banks has been made possible through the generous support of the Anchor Point Foundation, helping nonprofit organizations and leaders creatively solve problems in their communities around the world.